on to players whose names have been floated around as potential trade targets for the Denver Broncos. And just because a player is on this list doesn't necessarily mean I think they will even be traded or I think the Broncos should trade for them. But their names have been floated around in the media as potential trade targets. Now, in the left-hand column, I have the player name and their current team. I have their age entering the 2022 season. And then on the right-hand column, I have their 2022 salary if they are traded. So that is the number that their new team would have to take on in the event that they get traded. So first on this list, and the player who is almost guaranteed to not be on their current team next season, and that is Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, Garoppolo, of course, was a former second-round pick in the New England Patriots out of Illinois State back in 2014, and he was a guy who was potentially regarded among New England media and the NFL media in general as a potential successor to Tom Brady. Of course, he ended up starting 2 games in place of Brady in 2016 when he was suspended for the Deflategate scandal, and he ended up suffering a shoulder injury in game 2 of that 4-game suspension, so he only played in 2 of those games and honestly looked really good. And he ended up getting traded to San Francisco after potential reports that Tom Brady went to Robert Kraft and demanded the trade because Belichick wanted to roll with Garoppolo, but that's a different story for a different day. He was traded to the 49ers in the middle of the 2017 season where he became their starting quarterback for the last 5 games and actually led the team to a 5-0 record. Then in 2018, he ended up getting injured in week 3, tearing his ACL versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and missed the rest of the season. Returning in 2019, Garoppolo actually played pretty well. He ended up leading San Francisco all the way to the Super Bowl, where unfortunately probably one of the most infamous plays of his career happened. He airmailed Emmanuel Sanders on a deep post that would have pretty much iced the game against the Kansas City Chiefs, and then Patrick Mahomes goes on to come back and win the game, and it was a big knife in the heart for 49ers fans. Now, Garoppolo in 2020 was hampered the entire season by a high ankle sprain and only played in a handful of games, and in those games you could definitely tell he was struggling, so it was a completely lost season for Garoppolo in 2020. And as a result of pretty much a history of unreliability, the 49ers traded up in the draft to select Trey Lance out of North Dakota State, number 3 overall. Now, Lance did get some playing time last year in place of an injured Garoppolo and was up and down, honestly, but I do feel like it would be the best interest of the team to move on to Lance as their starting quarterback. So Jimmy Garoppolo is projected to be traded this offseason, and I do feel there are some things Jimmy Garoppolo does well. He's operated most of his career in a West Coast style offense similar to what Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett and offensive coordinator Justin Outen will run. He operates pretty well in the short and intermediate passing game. He does, however, have some major issues. He's usually good for at least one boneheaded decision per play, and it's usually one of those, pardon my French, but Jimmy, what the fuck are you doing type plays. And frankly, they usually come at the least opportune time, usually at a critical moment in the game. He does not have the most arm talent in the world. He doesn't have the strongest arm. He's got a quick release, but his arm strength isn't fantastic, and it will rear its ugly head at times, particularly in the deep passing game. I mean, there are times where he'll throw deep posts in the dirt. Sometimes he'll overthrow them. His accuracy downfield is just wild and crazy inaccurate. So as a result, he tends to miss deep throws on a very consistent basis. And as I alluded to earlier, injuries have also been a concern with Garoppolo. He has only started all 16 games once, and that was in the 2019 season when they went to the Super Bowl. And this past season, more injuries. This past season was no exception to that rule. He suffered a calf injury earlier in the season and missed one game, forcing the 49ers to start Trey Lance. And then towards the end of the year, he suffered thumb and shoulder injuries, and this is where an interesting angle of this comes into play. It was recently announced that Jimmy Garoppolo is going to have shoulder surgery this offseason, and he's scheduled to miss up to 4 months. So that would put him around the July return timeline, and so that's a little tight for training camp, and he's going to miss OTAs and a lot of offensive install stuff that, quite frankly, is really important. Those are a lot of reps that Garoppolo, frankly, would not get with his new team. And if he is traded next season, he is going to cost $25.5 million against the cap for his new team. That's where I feel a really interesting angle comes into play. I don't know if Jimmy Garoppolo is actually going to get traded. The 49ers may have to release him. I feel like most GMs are going to be smart and patient and not take on what is mostly a bloated whale of a contract and $25 million for a 1-year rental for Garoppolo when you don't know what his shoulder health situation is going to be. So I feel like a smart GM would wait for the 49ers to release him and sign him to a much cheaper deal as opposed to having to pay him $25.5 million plus give up a top 100 pick likely in return as compensation. So there is a legitimate chance that Garoppolo may not get traded. An argument made for him to be traded is, of course, what about the market for him? If you let him hit the free agent market, then there's a chance you may miss out on him. Well, personally, I feel like there's only going to be about 3 teams that are going to be strongly in play for Garoppolo, and that is the Washington Commanders, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Denver Broncos. And quite frankly, I feel like George Paton would maybe be okay with willing to gamble on losing out on Garoppolo if there's a chance you could maybe get him at a cheaper deal while getting to keep your draft capital, and maybe you'd use that second or third round pick that you gave up to get Garoppolo on a quarterback or potentially a safety or something along those lines, maybe an edge rusher. You'd be able to fill another need with that draft pick, and maybe you could potentially wait for Garoppolo to hit the open market, and the Broncos have money to throw at him, so maybe you would give Garoppolo a 1-year, $15 million deal or something along those lines. Or something else you could do is potentially ask the 49ers to eat some of Garoppolo's 2022 salary to facilitate a trade. I feel like, honestly, that's a more realistic scenario if Garoppolo were to be traded. But again, I just feel like a smart team will just wait for 49ers to release him and then sign him later. That way, again, you can save the draft pick and get him on a much cheaper ticket, and hopefully you get a 1-year rental for him and hope it works out. So that's what I would be a lot more in favor of George Paton doing if he wants to go the Garoppolo route. I would not be the most excited if he did just flat out trade for Garoppolo coming off that shoulder injury and all the other injury concerns and concerns just on the field in general. I just don't feel like it would be a good move for the Broncos long term. I feel like you'd just be setting yourself back if you gave up a top 100 pick for Jimmy Garoppolo with all these question marks. Now, obviously, Jimmy is highly regarded as a good dude. I mean, guys in the 49ers locker room love him. The 49ers coaching staff love him. Like, Garoppolo is one of those high character players, but again, I just don't know if he's worth the asking price. Maybe you can, again, be patient and hope his value drops, but if it doesn't, I don't feel like that would be the worst scenario for the Broncos to miss out on the Jimmy Garoppolo sweepstakes. Next up, we have a player who does have ties to George Paton and new Broncos quarterbacks coach Clint Kubiak, but a player who I strongly believe is not going to get traded in Vikings quarterback Kirk Cousins. Now, Cousins is going to be entering his age 34 season, and If he gets traded, his new team is going to have to take on a whopping $35 million cap hit. Now, the Vikings are definitely going to have to figure out a way to lower Kirk Cousins' cap hit. He's owed $35 million plus a $10 million signing bonus for a whopping $45 million against the cap on a 1 year remaining on his contract. That being said, I feel like there are better ways for the Vikings to approach this than to just get rid of him. First of all, Cousins and new Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell do have familiarity together from their days in Washington when O'Connell was Cousins' quarterback coach. I do feel like Cousins was a big factor in O'Connell coming to Minnesota, quite frankly. And there's a big question of who do you replace Kirk Cousins with if you let him go. Now, the biggest reason why I don't feel the Vikings are going to move on from Kirk Cousins is the glaring question of, are you really in position to upgrade from him? And if not, then who are you going to replace him with? Now, the Vikings do have former 2021 third-round pick Kellen Mond out of Texas A&M on the roster, who does bring some talent to the table, but never got a very ringing endorsement from the previous regime. Kellen Mond never got a very ringing endorsement from the previous regime. In fact, Mike Zimmer kind of went out of his way to crap on him in a press conference. A really low blow, in my opinion. But maybe the new regime with General Manager Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and head coach Kevin O'Connell will view Mond a little bit differently. That being said, I don't feel he would be an upgrade over Kirk Cousins at this point. Cousins is one of the more underrated players in the league, in my opinion. I feel like he gets a lot of unnecessary crap. He does a lot of things well. I don't necessarily feel like Kirk Cousins is a quarterback that's going to win you a championship because you do see him kind of crumble in big moments. But he's not... He does do a lot more things well than he does not well, if that makes sense. Despite all the things Kirk does well, I still feel he is overpaid in a quarterback market that is frankly starved of good quarterback play, and Kirk does bring good quarterback play. I feel like if the Vikings moved on from him, they would really be entering into the pit of misery because you're not going to upgrade from Kirk Cousins at this point. Maybe if you full-blown commit to tanking, but that would involve getting rid of pretty much all of the talent on your roster, and who knows, maybe the Vikings are going to do that. But I feel like Kirk was a major factor in the Kevin O'Connell hire, so he is going to stick around in Minnesota next year. I feel like they're going to figure out some way to lower his cap number. They're going to figure out an extension of some kind, maybe add 1 or 2 years to his deal, maybe a void year at the end of it, so that way it'll distribute some of that cap money down the road, and that way it'll lower his cap hit for the 2022 season. Another idea is maybe they could just potentially approach him, just restructure the deal to remain in Minnesota for 1 more year. That's a potential option. Or they could just let it play out. I don't feel that would be a smart option, but that is something they could do, because at the end of the day, I don't feel the Vikings are going to get any better at quarterback than what they already have. So it would not be a smart move for them to move on from Kirk Cousins. So while he may be an option for the Broncos, I don't think he's going to land on the market for the Broncos. So I feel like I've discussed Kirk Cousins more than I should have, so moving on. Next up, we have the youngest, cheapest, and in my opinion, most intriguing option on this list in Philadelphia Eagles quarterback Gardner Minshew. Now, Minshew is only 26, and he is by far the cheapest quarterback on this list. If someone were to trade for him, his new team were to only take on a $2.5 million cap hit. Quite frankly, that's a really cheap deal. The reason it's so low is because it's his final year of his 4-year rookie contract. Minshew being a former 6th round pick of the Jacksonville Jaguars back in 2019. Minshew ended up taking over as the starter for Nick Foles after Foles suffered an injury and frankly never gave the job back up. Minshew provided a really big spark to the team. His energy was awesome. He found a way to win games. And I feel like the Jaguars never really appreciated what they had in Gardner Minshew. I feel like if they had made a more conscious effort to put pieces around Gardner Minshew, he could have really panned out into a really successful quarterback in this league. And I'm still thinking he has a chance to do that at such a young age. Now, the Jacksonville Jaguars ownership, led by owner Shad Khan, was pretty dead set on tanking for the former Clemson quarterback Trevor Lawrence, scheduled to come out in the 2021 draft. Let's just say they successfully completed the mission in 2020, only winning one game that season. And Minshew was, in my opinion, unfairly pulled from his starting job. You could very obviously tell that ownership wanted them to put in the lesser option, first in Jake Luton, then in Mike Glennon, so they would secure the number one overall pick. And they tried to save face and say that it was because of an injury, but you could very obviously tell that they were benching Minshew because he was winning them. He would have won them games, and they would have potentially lost out on Trevor Lawrence. It was a really shitty situation, and Minshew ended up getting traded to the Philadelphia Eagles following the 2021 preseason, and he ended up starting 2 games for them in 2021. One of them for an injured Jalen Hurts against the Jets mid-season. The other one when the Eagles rested their starters Week 18 versus Dallas after clinching a playoff berth. And in my opinion, he played really well in those games. He completed 68 of his passes for 439 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception while posting a 1-1 record. And quite frankly, he really did look good, even though in the Week 18 game when the Eagles had pretty much pulled all their starters out and it was the Eagles practice squad against the Cowboys practice squad who had also clinched a playoff berth. I still feel like Minshew had made some good throws and made some good decisions despite going against basically a skeleton defense with practice squad receivers to throw to. I feel like Gardner Minshew really can play in this league, and Broncos fans should look no further than Week 4 of 2019 when he was with the Jaguars. He ended up leading the Jaguars down 17-6 at halftime to a come-from-behind victory. He finds a way to rally the troops. It would be a very interesting acquisition, in my opinion. I feel like we could maybe offer Philly a 5th or a 6th round pick and maybe allow Minshew to compete with Drew Lock and a rookie, kind of a common theme here, in my opinion. I really feel like if we miss out on Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, the team is going to dip their toes into this free agent or trade market and maybe bring in a rookie quarterback on the cheap. But if we were to approach it like that, I definitely feel like Gardner Minshew would be the most intriguing option on this list, especially because of his age and his cost, and in my opinion, his upside as well. I feel like Gardner Minshew can definitely play in this league, and I feel like if given the opportunity, he could be a quality starter in this league. So if we were to go in the direction that I feel like the team is going to go, Gardner Minshew is towards the top of my list. Finally, we have another player who, honestly, I doubt anyone is going to trade for, and that is Indianapolis Colts quarterback Carson Wentz, who was going to be entering his age 29 season. Now, if you trade for Carson Wentz, you are taking on a $28.3 million cap hit. That being said, if the Colts were to cut him, they would save $15 million while taking a $13 million cap hit. Ever since Wentz's 2017 season where he was the MVP frontrunner before tearing his ACL towards the end of the season in a game against the Los Angeles Rams, his career has really been on a volatile downward spiral. He really has regressed as the years have gone on since that season, and it was so much so that in the 2020 draft, the Philadelphia Eagles drafted Jalen Hurts out of Oklahoma in the 2nd round, and this really kind of ended the downward trajectory that ended Wentz's career in Philadelphia, and it really ended on bad terms. You can read into that more online if you want to. It's really a fascinating read, in my opinion. He was then acquired by his former offensive coordinator, Frank Reich, who is now the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. At the time, was the offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles, who helped Carson Wentz lead to his All-Pro season in 2017. They were hoping that maybe they could recapture some of that magic in Indianapolis, and unfortunately, that just was not the case. Wentz's play really regressed as the season went on, and despite the Colts having 7 Pro Bowlers and 5 All Pros on the roster, along with the league's leading rusher and Jonathan Taylor to boot, the season ended on a very sour note. The Colts lost their final 2 games of the season, a loss to the Las Vegas Raiders and then an embarrassing Week 18 loss to the at the time 2-win Jacksonville Jaguars 26-17. That loss eliminated the Colts from playoff contention. Wentz was a primary culprit in that loss, completing just 59% of his passes for 185 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception, plus a lost fumble. And it was really just a horrific ending to the Colts season that just really began to just spiral downhill as time went on. The time that has ensued, Colts general manager Chris Ballard and head coach Frank Reich have been very non-committal about Wentz's future in Indianapolis. Multiple reports from multiple NFL insiders have indicated that the Colts could release Wentz before his 2022 salary becomes fully guaranteed. I personally feel like mentally Carson Wentz is just a broken down player, and I don't know if anyone's going to trade for him, especially at the price that it would take financially to do so. Someone may take a flyer on him if he gets cut, but I'd really be against the Broncos doing so. It's just overall not a very good fit, and I think Carson Wentz's best days in the league are definitely behind him. So I definitely would look elsewhere if I were the Broncos.